Okay, welcome everybody to the live webinar here at BINA. I'm sure you're all aware that there is a situation right now going on in our holy land of Israel, and whenever such a thing happens, thank God no one's been hurt, but whenever the security of our land is being threatened, we all feel it, even those of us who don't live in Israel. And therefore I wanted to dedicate the shir, which is actually about Israel, connected to this week's parsha, but it's about Israel, we're going to dedicate this to the peace and security of our brothers and sisters in our holy land, that God should shower upon them His protection, and they should know of no pain. So, in this week's parsha, we learn about the mitzvah of Shemitah. Shemitah is every 7 years. There is a sabbatical year in the land of Israel where the farmers, the workers of the land, have to take a break for a year, and they spend the time learning Torah, whatever the case is. Nowadays, there are some people who actually do that, who just stop working the land in Israel we're talking about. There are some people who rely on leniency called heter mechira, that you sell the land to a non-Jew, whatever the case is, but the mitzvah still applies, the concept still applies, the mitzvah of Shemitah, which is actually why, interestingly enough, if you land up somewhere in India and you're looking for kosher food, usually fruit and vegetables, you're safe. In Israel, it's actually not like that. In Israel, you have to make sure that your fruit and vegetables have a hechsher, because you have to make sure that not only the mitzvah of Shemitah, but there's other agricultural mitzvahs which only apply in the land of Israel, and one actually has to be mindful of that for those who are in Israel. So, just two insights into the concept of Shemitah, and the second one will shed some light into the uniqueness of the land of Israel. Just the physical land is unique and holy. But first, one idea, that when the Torah introduced, which is connected to Shavuos as well, when the Torah introduces Shemitah, the mitzvah of Shemitah in this week's parsha, it starts off saying, God spoke to Moses saying, on Har Sinai, on Mount Sinai. Now, the phrase Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lamer, God spoke to Moses saying, is one of the most commonly used phrases in the Torah. Nowhere else, or basically nowhere else, does it say, God spoke to Moses saying on Mount Sinai. We know where God spoke to Moses. Of course he spoke to him on Mount Sinai. Why by the mitzvah of Shemitah does the Torah choose to tell us the location of where this discussion happened? So Rashi answers a famous concept, that Torah chooses one mitzvah to do it, to tell me that all the other mitzvahs were also said, all the other commandments were also told to Moses on Mount Sinai. However, the question still remains, why Shemitah? Why does the Torah choose this mitzvah to tell us that it was said on Har Sinai? So the Kli Yakar, one of the commentaries on the Chumash, explains, based on that this parsha is not only about Shemitah, it's about another thing, the Yovel year, the Jubilee year. That every 7 times 7, every 7 Shemitahs, in other words, every 49 years, the 50th year would also be holy and also be a sabbatical. Many other things would happen. Slaves would go free, land would go back to its owners. So that year they would actually have 2 years in a row that they wouldn't work. So the 50th year was also holy. Says the Kli Yakar, that's why it tells us that it was set on Mount Sinai. Because the Mount Sinai experience was like a mini Yovel experience, meaning that it was 7 weeks, each one containing 7 days, from Pesach as a preparation to the giving of the Torah. And the 50th day made Mount Sinai holy. What was the practical application of the holiness of Mount Sinai, besides for the thunder and lightning and fire and God's appearance? The practical application in law was that the Jewish people were forbidden to plow and plant the land of Mount Sinai. Though, in theory, if they wanted to, I'm not sure if anyone tried to, but if someone wanted to go and plow the land of Mount Sinai, at that moment it became forbidden because the mountain became holy. Says the Kli Yakar, that's the same exact thing that happens in the Shemitah cycle. There are 7 cycles of 7, and the 50th year is holy. And that's why the Torah hints this by saying that this command was said at Mount Sinai, because the Mount Sinai experience with the 7 weeks preparation was like a mini Yovel Shemitah sort of experience. That's just an interesting insight into the verse. Moving on now to the actual mitzvah of Shemitah. What is the reason for this mitzvah? This will give us insight into the uniqueness of the land of Israel. So it's brought a number of answers. The one answer that is brought is that it's good for the land. That if you leave the land every 7 years barren, you don't do anything with it, it actually makes the land more fertile. The issue with that answer that the Kli Yakar, the same commentator asks, is that, first of all, we know that the punishment for not keeping Shemitah, in fact, the parsha itself says, if you keep Shemitah, v'yishaftem la'aretz levetach, I think that's the expression, which means that you will settle in your land, v'yishaftem la'aretz levetach, you will settle on the land peacefully, which seems to imply that if you don't keep Shemitah, you will not be in the land peacefully. Right? The Kli Yakar asks, if the reason is because of the land, why is there such a punishment? The punishment should be the natural consequence. You don't keep Shemitah, your land won't be fertile. If that's the whole concept, that's the whole reason of Shemitah, why is there such a severe punishment that you'll be expelled from the land of Israel? Also, he says, the expression which is used is that Shemitah is Shabbos LaHashem, is a year of rest for the sake of God. If this is the whole reason, then it's a year of rest for the sake of the land. There's nothing to do with God. So he doesn't take that reason as the ultimate reason. Obviously, it's a reason which is said, so it's a reason, but it's not the ultimate reason for Shemitah. Then he says, another reason which is given is that it's to remind us that God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So we have 6 years of working and 7 year resting. The issue with that is, number one, how does that, every 7 years you have a reminder? I mean, that's a little bit interesting. Second of all, for that we have Shabbos. We work 6 days and we rest on Shabbos. Why do we need Shemitah for that? Says the Kli Yakar, Shemitah is not there to remind us that God created the world. He's there to remind us that God continues to run the world, especially in the land of Israel. Because when the Jewish people were in the desert, they had bread falling from heaven, they had man every single day. They didn't need to be reminded that their parnassah, their livelihood, comes from God. That was obvious. The water came from rocks, manna fell from the heaven. That was an obvious reality. As soon as they went into the land of Israel, they would have to work. They would have to physically get involved in producing their own food, their own livelihood. Now they can make a mistake that it's their own achievement. The expression which is used is koichi va'oitzim yodi asali sachai lazeh. It's my strength, my achievement, which achieved all of this success. Therefore, God gave them the mitzvah of Shemitah. Says the Kli Yakar like this. I'm not a farmer, but I'm going to take his word for it. He says that the real way to ensure that the land will be fertile is actually if you leave the land every 2 years, and then you work the land for 2 years, and in the third year, you let it rest. He says to work the land for 6 years straight is actually bad for the land. And therefore God is saying, do what's actually not good. 6 years straight, work the land, and I'll show you that nevertheless your field will be fertile. In other words, you'll see clearly the hand of God involved in the process. That's one miracle. The second miracle is not only your field won't be ruined, but it will actually produce more. Like we know, the Pasuk tells us, if you are worried, what am I going to eat in the 7th year if I don't plant, says the Pasuk, God will command his blessing that you'll have enough to eat for the 6th year and for the 7th year. And for the 8th year in the Yovel year. So what's normally produced for 1 year, you'll produce enough produce to last you for 3 years. But the miracle goes further. And he learns this from the expression that the verse uses, that he says, this is his chidush, his novelty, that he says that it's not that there was more produce that grew. The same amount of produce that would last you normally for 1 year lasted you for 3, meaning not the quantity increased, the quality increased. You ate less and you were full, and therefore it lasted you for 3 years. Tremendous miracles that they experienced in the Shemitah year. All of this is to remind you that our livelihood, although we need to work, although it's a mitzvah to work, but we're just doing the practical work, but the success comes from God. Therefore, he says, now we can understand the punishment for not keeping Shemitah. Because the land of Israel is unique, says the Kli Yakar. The land of Israel is a land which wants to be owned by God. It does not want to be owned by human beings. The land of Israel is a holy land. It has, so to speak, a consciousness. So to speak. It wants to be owned by God and not by the human being. When we keep Shemitah, not only physically keep it, but when we understand the message of Shemitah, That when we're in the land of Israel, it's not that it's my work and I own this land, but it's God's land, that He's letting us live there. In other words, we're living in God's land. Then the land of Israel says, please stay. I want you here because I want that God should be my owner. But if we forget that, if we start thinking that it belongs to me and it's my achievement that I worked the land and I was successful, then says the Kli Yakar, the land will throw you out because the land can't handle being under the ownership of human being. It wants to stay under the ownership of God. So Hashem should help that we should internalize this message. And in that merit, Hashem should, once again, should shower His blessings on the land of Israel and keep them strong and in peace, and they should just be successful more and more as they have been until now, but even in a more increasing way. Have a wonderful day.